Welcome to our second lecture of the week as we begin a discussion of the Cold War and specifically the origins of the Cold War and the U.S.'s general strategy when the Cold War began in the immediate post-World War II years, and then also a look at the fall of China to the Communist Party as well as the Korean War. A housekeeping note before we get into today's lecture, since we are limited as we approach the final week of classes before finals, we are limited on time, so I'm going to try to devote each lecture to discuss things in as great detail as I can. So I'm going to describe the origins of the Cold War and the general outlines of the two sides in today's lecture, and then in the next lecture, which will be posted by the end of the weekend, probably sometime tomorrow evening or perhaps early Monday morning, but most likely tomorrow evening, discuss McCarthyism and its impact on the Cold War, but also discuss the 1950s atmosphere of economic growth and prosperity in America and the rise of suburbia and quite a bit of socioeconomic changes in the U.S. And then next week we will focus on a few other pertinent, topics in the 1950s, 60s era America, such as the Civil Rights Movement, the Great Society, and the unraveling of the 1960s. So that's sort of our short-term and long-term agenda for these final 5 lectures, including today's, before the class period portion of the semester wraps up at the end of next week. So let us start by describing the Cold War and sort of tracing its origins, if you will. World War II ends in the spring of 1945 and summer of 1945, and it ends in Europe. Victory in Europe, VE Day, is in May of 1945, as we discussed last lecture, and VJ Day, the end of the war in the Pacific Theater, was in August of 1945, September of 1945. So it went on through the summer in the Pacific Theater, but for all intents and purposes, the war in Europe was over by early May 1945. And as the war ended, as the Allied forces closed in on victory in Europe, there were signs that the Soviet Union, the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, indicated that it would break away from America and Britain. They were allies of America and Britain during the war, but in the post-war era, and particularly in the immediate post-war era, there was a split as Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, basically denounced the capitalist economic system that was prevalent in the U.S. and much of Western Europe at the time. Stalin, in 1946, lamented that international peace was highly unlikely, as he put, quote, under the present capitalist development of the world economy. That specific statement signaled a major ideological difference between the Soviet Union and the United States. The Soviet Union had been operating under a communist system since 1920 or so, since 1919, 1920, when the Tsarist government fell to the communists back in the at the start of the 1920s in the U.S., and Stalin was sort of the next generation of that in the middle part of the 20th century. It's important to note this ideological difference in this split because after World War II, the U.S. and the Soviet Union had emerged as the two global superpowers. Europe is in shambles because of the war of that had taken place there. World War II, similar to the Great War, in that Europe, the battles were all over Europe, and a lot of land was destroyed, a lot of factories were destroyed. Germany was wiped out by the end of World War II in terms of its government regime. And so it was going to take a while for Europe to get back on its feet economically and culturally in the war. And so that sort of left America, which participated in the war, but other than the bombing of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, which wasn't yet a state at the time that it was bombed in 1941, the war had not taken place on American soil. So American real estate, American factories and industry were essentially intact at the end of the war. America operated on an economic system as it still does today, based on capitalism, free market capitalism, while the Soviet Union embraced a communist system. I want to move into exactly what the Cold War looked like now from a strategic standpoint. One of the more influential figures in the early Cold War era from the U.S. side was a man named George Kennan, who was an American diplomat stationed in the Soviet Union at the end of World War II. He wrote a lengthy dispatch to the American State Department in which he explained the historical and psychological origins that served as the foundation for the Soviets' communist system, and he implored the Truman administration under President Harry Truman to employ a strategy of containment against the Soviet Union. And so what that meant exactly was, instead of going to war or using military force, Kennan suggested, quote, a long-term, patient but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive territories. What that meant was, do not let Russia expand across all of Europe. One of the lessons of World War II was that countries that had a chance to perhaps stop Hitler before he became dominant had failed to do so, had neglected to do so. They had extended the benefit of the doubt that Hitler could be appeased by just ceding this territory here or that territory there. We talked about the Sudetenland and Alsace and Lorraine in France, and getting part of the Czech Republic, that Hitler would be satisfied with that. That's what the leaders of Britain and France thought, anyway, in the late 1930s. As it turns out, Hitler was not satisfied. He wanted nothing short of global domination and global control, and he seized the rest of Czechoslovakia and then invaded Poland in 1939, which of course started a World War II in earnest. And so Kennan's advice to the U.S. and to President Truman and his aides was to prevent a similar situation from happening with the Soviet Union and Stalin. It was likely that the Soviets could control most of Eastern Europe, but Western Europe was the area in which it was crucial for America, as well as for the countries of Western Europe, Britain and France, and those nations, to try to continue operating under a democratic form of government with an economic system based on capitalism or the principles of capitalism. So as a result of all this, by the late 1940s, Europe was effectively split into two specific sectors. The nations in the eastern part of the continent, which were controlled by communist regimes backed by the Soviet Union. Those countries included Poland, Romania, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Yugoslavia. Those were countries that were what's known as Eastern Bloc countries in Europe, and those were the countries that were sort of under the thumb, if you will, of the Soviets, and that the governments of those countries had similar ideological principles as Stalin and the Soviet government, and they were more or less able to be persuaded by the Soviet government on just about any issue of national or regional significance. The rest of Europe, Western Europe, featured the democratic nations, Great Britain, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, Denmark, and others. Those countries were trying to stick to a democratic form of government, and they had the tacit support and backing of the United States at that time. And remember, Hitler and in Germany and Mussolini in Italy were able to rise to power when they did in the mid-20s, in the early to mid-30s, because of economic collapse in Europe after World War I, and there was a great deal of angst and economic resentment too, within Europe at that time, because industry had more or less been decimated, and it was difficult to survive financially in Europe during the 20s and the 30s. And in that vacuum of economic stability, or lack of economic stability, Hitler rose to power in Germany, Mussolini rose to power in Italy. They supported Francisco Franco, who rose to power in Spain at the end of the Spanish Civil War in the late 1930s. So the idea was take whatever steps were necessary, short of all-out military engagement, to ensure that the same fate did not occur in Western Europe in the late 1940s, in the 1950s, and the 1960s, to avoid a potential usurpation by a totalitarian government and a totalitarian regime. So how does that work exactly? How do you stabilize Europe if you're the United States, trying to prevent the entire continent from falling under control of Stalin and the Soviet Union? And so Truman and the U.S. government decided that the best way to ensure that Western Europe did not succumb to pressure from Russia was through financial assistance, by committing financial aid to help Europe rebuild and avoid total economic collapse. So this started in 1947 when Congress passed legislation that provided economic aid to Greece and to Turkey. That aid enabled those countries to stabilize their economies, and with Greece in particular, there was a communist insurrection brewing. With the economic aid in the U.S., Greece was able to effectively defeat that insurrection and remain a democratic nation in 1949. And it's important to note that George Marshall, who was a former military general in the U.S., by 1949 he had become Secretary of State in the Truman administration, and he was very much in support of providing financial aid to the Western European nations to ensure that containment would work as a strategy. In fact, Marshall argued that our policy is directed not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. Reading between the lines, what he's basically trying to say there is that if the European countries in the western part of the continent are able to stabilize their economies so that their people are not poor and hungry, but rather can make ends meet and survive and thrive, or at least get on the road to thriving economically, then there will be no need for them to fall into the thrall, if you will, of the Soviet Union, that they would basically say to Stalin and any other communist supporters that, hey, our country and its economic system is working well as it is. I personally have a nice situation with and can pay my bills, so why do we need to go into a communist system and away from what we've always been? So the U.S. ultimately employed what was officially the European Recovery Plan. It became known as the Marshall Plan, as it sort of was the manifestation of Marshall's argument. It was presented to Congress near the end of 1947, and Congress passed the legislation early in 1948. And as a result of this, America distributed $13 billion in economic aid to Europe, to the countries of Western Europe, between the years 1948 and 1951. That is an awful lot of money for the middle part of the 20th century. It's still a lot of money today, but especially in the middle part of the 20th century, going to countries, again, to stabilize their economies, to help them rebuild factories, businesses, infrastructure, etc., so that business could return to a pre-war level or pre-war levels much sooner than it would have done without the aid. If you take a look at the image in the upper right-hand corner of this slide, this is a very good illustration of what the Cold War looked like, geographically speaking, on a map. And you can see the big country to the far right side of the map is the Soviet Union. It is in red, as it is a communist country. And you can see that the countries that border the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Yugoslavia, etc., those countries are also in red because they have governments that are approved, backed, supported by the Soviet Union. They're basically communist governments. East Germany is also part of this this communist red portion of the map, if you will. And if you look at the blue countries on the map, you see the United Kingdom, you see Ireland, you see France and Italy and the Netherlands and Luxembourg and several other countries, Denmark. And those countries are in blue. Those countries are remaining democratic in their government regime as well, and are being supported by the United States through the economic aid provided by the Marshall Plan during the early 1950s. But as we'll see in a moment when we discuss our next slide, that this is sort of the way, this map, and is sort of the way that the split will look like throughout the remainder of the 20th century for the most part. This more or less crystallized this map and these sides in the early 1950s, and it would remain that way until 1991 with the collapse of the communist regime in the Soviet Union in 1991. So let's pick up on that and discuss the official alliances, and then we'll move on to communism in China and in Asia before we wrap up today's lecture. We mentioned the Marshall Plan and the economic aid that America sent to the Western European nations to prevent them from falling under the spell of the Soviet Union like their counterparts in Eastern Europe had done. And officially in 1949, the American alliance and Western European alliance would come into fruition. In April of 1949, the Western European nations, along with the United States, signed what was known as the North Atlantic Treaty, and it basically stated that any military attack on any of the countries that had signed the North Atlantic Treaty would be considered an attack against the entire group, and thus would be subject to reprisal or retaliation by the entire group. So what does that mean exactly? It means that if the Soviet Union tried to attack, say, Luxembourg, Britain and France and the U.S. would consider that an attack against themselves as well, and they would come to Luxembourg's aid and engage in a military commitment against conflict against the Soviet Union and whatever other Eastern European nations would join them. The treaty also established what became known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or as it's more popularly referred to by its acronym, NATO. NATO was the governing council of this group. So the countries that signed this treaty and officially joined what became known as NATO were as follows: America, Great Britain, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Canada, Denmark, Iceland, Italy, Norway, and Portugal. So all of these countries banded together in 1949. A few years later, in 1952, Greece and Turkey joined this same alliance. They were subsequently followed by West Germany in 1955 and Spain decades later in 1982. The reason why it took Spain so long to officially join NATO and the rest of their Western European brethren, if you will, was because of the outcome of the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939. Francisco Franco took control of Spain. He was a communist leader, and Spain was under control of Franco from 1939 up until the mid-1970s. I believe he died sometime around 1975, 1976. I don't know that off the top of my head, but that's why it took so long for Spain to join the other Western European nations and officially become part of NATO. Several years after the North Atlantic Treaty and NATO were signed into agreement, a similar treaty was signed by the Eastern European nations in the mid-1950s that officially outlined their own alliance. This was known as the Warsaw Treaty Organization. So this very much is the official battle lines, if you will, from an ideological standpoint, from a government standpoint, have been formed by the mid-1950s with the Warsaw Treaty Organization. That was the alliance of the Eastern European countries, and with backing and support of the Soviet Union, and the North Atlantic Treaty and NATO, the Western European nations, and the backing of the United States of America. So that's the way things look by the mid-1950s, and that's essentially the way things stay, as I mentioned, for the decades that followed. The Cold War, as George Kennan basically articulated and implored at the very outset of the post-war era, the Cold War was largely ideological and largely fought, in the court of ideas, I guess, for lack of a better term. There wasn't a lot of military engagement because neither the United States nor the Soviet Union was interested in engaging in a world war just like the one that had just ended, World War II. Nobody wanted to start World War III, especially once the Soviet Union was able to develop the technology for nuclear weapons by the early to middle part of the 1950s. America and the Soviets knew that either one of them could send a nuclear bomb and destroy the other nation, and they were very hesitant to use that. But they remained vigilant against each other during these decades. It was sort of an uneasy suspicion, if you will, or silence that they had, but it did not really manifest itself out into major military engagement, at least not with sort of the fate of Europe and global dominance and supremacy at stake, the way that it had been with both the Great War, World War I, and World War II. Remember, these wars are expensive in terms of the amount of money that each nation has to spend on the war, and the fact that wherever the war is fought, you're talking about decimating an area from an industrial and an economic standpoint, and they're costly in terms of casualties and lives lost. And so people are reluctant to go to war on a whim, if you will, and that's what we see playing out in the Cold War era in the decades that follow NATO and the Warsaw Treaty Organization. However, one place where the Communist Party was successful outside of Eastern Europe in the post-war era was China. In 1949, communist forces led by Mao Zedong defeated Chinese nationalists and officially took over the Chinese government. China, with Mao Zedong at the helm of government, became a communist nation and a totalitarian regime. It is still very much that way today. Mao Zedong reigned at the top of this governmental regime from 1949, when the war ended in the fall of 1949, until his death in the mid-1970s, and there have been various successors to Mao ever since he passed away 40-plus years ago. This development was seen as a significant blow to America, which had tried to maintain a peace with China, or peace in China, I should say, in the immediate post-World War II years. They did not want China to fall into communist hands, but at the same time, they weren't quite willing to provide a full-scale military force to ensure that that the status quo government in China would be sustained in the late 1940s. Shortly after China became communist, a conflict broke out in Korea that more or less split Korea into two, North Korea and South Korea. Soviet Union backed the forces of North Korea, which was trying to overtake South Korea and basically establish one nation that would have been communist, totalitarian in its government. The U.S. supported the South Korean forces, and a military force from the United Nations engaged in the conflict in Korea during that time period. It's important to note that it was a UN military force, but most of the soldiers were American soldiers. It was under the command of Douglas MacArthur, who was an American general rather. And because it was UN military forces and there were technically soldiers from other nations, this was a war that Truman led the United States into without Congress ever officially declaring it as a war. So it's kind of been referred to historically as a conflict rather than a war, but it was indeed a war with some significant casualties. MacArthur led the UN military forces for most of the war against North Korea, which had Soviet backing, as I mentioned, and China as well. China supplied troops to the North Korean effort. In the spring of 1951, things really begin to shift in the Korean conflict as Douglas MacArthur, with China engaging on the North Korean/Soviet side of the war, he wants an all-out, full-scale war against China, up to and including the use of nuclear weapons. Harry Truman, the President of the United States, disagrees with MacArthur's position. He believes that it's not the right time or the right place to get involved in another major military excursion, invasion, if you will, on the heels of ending World War II just 6 years earlier, that America was not in position to go into another major large-scale war, and he certainly was very reticent about the idea of using nuclear weapons against China or using it in Korea. So Truman denied MacArthur's request for this full-on war. After that request was denied, MacArthur publicly denounced Truman, and as a result of that, Truman fired Douglas MacArthur essentially for insubordination. But just a couple of months after this happens, this all basically comes to a head in April of 1951. And a couple of months later, the Soviet Union and the United States preliminarily agreed to a ceasefire in Korea, but they did not finalize a peace agreement in Korea. So the war continued to drag on for another couple of years until an official peace agreement was signed in July of 1953. By that time, Truman was out of office, and Dwight Eisenhower, the general of the Allied forces for Operation Overlord, aka D-Day in World War II, was now early into his first term as President of the United States. And it's under the Eisenhower administration when the ceasefire occurs, or rather when the peace agreement occurs, and the Korean conflict is officially over. And the battle lines from that conflict are still largely the same today. As many of you may be aware, there are two Korean nations, North Korea and South Korea. North Korea is run by a totalitarian government, and South Korea is run by a democratic government, and Americans and other foreigners from Western European nations are, shall we say, unwelcome in North Korea. If you're an American and you wind up in North Korea, you're likely going to be imprisoned there for decades, whereas South Korea is still very welcoming to most travelers around the world. There's a reason why the most recent Winter Olympics were held in South Korea back in 2018, and several decades ago, before the fall of communism in Russia in 1988, Seoul, South Korea hosted the Summer Olympics, which the U.S. and other democratic nations participated in. Anyway, one sort of footnote here to add and keep in mind, In 1950, while the U.S. is engaged in the Korean War, the U.S. also decides to officially recognize a French-backed government in Vietnam, or what is sort of the French colony of Indochina, or in that region, Indochina, Vietnam, where there was a grassroots group of guerrilla forces being led by a man named Ho Chi Minh, and Ho Chi Minh and the guerrilla forces were trying to take over Vietnam and turn it into a totalitarian government. The U.S., again, wanting to employ containment and not allow communism to spread throughout Southeast Asia, officially backs the French government in Vietnam and begins to send aid to the French against these guerrilla forces controlled by Ho Chi Minh. This is in the early 1950s, and this serves as the start, the beginning, if you will, of America's long involvement in Vietnam. By the mid to late 1950s, American troops are being sent to Vietnam to participate in the Vietnam War, and America would remain embattled or engulfed, I should say, in the Vietnam War through the 1960s and into the early to mid 1970s. It became a prolonged military engagement for the United States, and the philosophy behind the U.S. going into the war and staying in the war as long as it did was containment and ensuring that Vietnam didn't fall to communism, and that Southeast Asia, the other nations of Southeast Asia that bordered Vietnam, would avoid falling into communism and try to keep China as the lone communist nation in Asia during that era. So that's basically what the U.S. was trying to accomplish with their initial backing of the French government and their subsequent deployment of military troops. All of that sort of begins in the early 1950s and really, really ratchets up, for lack of a better term, by the mid to late 1950s and becomes a full-on military engagement by the U.S. Around the late 1950s and certainly into the 1960s. So that will wrap up today's lecture. Again, as I mentioned at the top of our discussion today, that there will be another lecture posted by the end of the weekend. We'll discuss McCarthyism and the post-war economic prosperity in the U.S. And economic growth in the U.S., particularly during the 1950s. So that's up next as we rapidly march toward the conclusion of this course and this semester here in 2021.